Hi everyone, it's your friend Joseph Craven, and it is a lovely Sunday afternoon. My neighbors are doing some yard work. I hear children playing outside in the neighborhood, and I'm sitting down to record a podcast. This is another overtime episode on Running Out the Clock. Overtime is, of course, when we take a little bit of a deeper dive into certain subject matters that pop up in a recording session, or maybe they just need to be discussed in the shape and realm of the SEC. And in this particular overtime episode, I'm going to be taking a look at two SEC West teams to talk a little bit about how these two teams really shape the battle for the top of the SEC West. And these two teams are, of course, the Auburn Tigers and the Mississippi State Bulldogs. Now, the first question we have to address is why these two teams in particular in the SEC West. And, I mean, if you feel like you have a firm understanding of how the two teams are made, then, well, first of all, maybe this isn't the right podcast episode for you and you should listen to something else. But also, this is, a chance to kind of take a look and just go back all the way to the basics of why exactly it is that these two teams are the two teams people are talking maybe the most about heading into this 2018-19 season when it comes to the SEC West. And the reason here, I mean, first and foremost, that we're not discussing the Alabama Crimson Tide is that the Tide are kind of heavy favorites to win the SEC West this season. So there's not a whole lot to necessarily talk about right here. They're defending national champions. They return a lot of offensive weapons. They upgrade in some offensive categories from where they have been. Defense, we've talked about, has some questions there, but the offense looks like it's going to be better, and they're going to rely on it. Alabama's kind of the favorite to win the West. But if they don't, who steps up? Well, a lot of people are predicting it to be either the Mississippi State Bulldogs or the Auburn Tigers that are kind of battling for that second in the West spot. Alabama in particular, of course, did not win the SEC West last season and did not play in the SEC championship game, and by most accounts should not have qualified for the college football playoff. But that's neither here nor there. We live in a world in which Alabama won it again for whatever reason, and we have to deal with that. Why not LSU? Well, LSU in particular this season has more questions than they do answers on both sides of the football. If you go back to our LSU preview, we talk a lot about the fact that, well, they don't know who their quarterback is, and at this point they also have lost two more quarterbacks that were expected to maybe battle for a starting position or at least train from here to take over in the next few years. Now they've got two quarterbacks on the roster, and it's looking less and less like they have any sort of quarterback stability that they have craved for years down in Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge, of course, well, LSU, has had, Baton Rouge themselves haven't, driven any quarterbacks away as far as I know. Baton Rouge is a fun town. I doubt the quarterbacks go there and say, oh my gosh, these people hate me, I need to leave. But there's something about the program, whether it be Ed Orgeron, whether it be Les Miles, they have not been able to lock down a quarterback there. They have that going on again, and it's worked out well in the past where they've had a good enough offensive line to control the line of scrimmage, and of course stellar running backs to capitalize off of that. They don't have that right now. They don't have who appears to be a clear-cut, awesome running back and an offensive line to work around. And on the other side, they don't have the same, commanding secondary or anything that they've had in the past. You could listen to our LSU preview to get more of a breakdown there, but the fact of the matter is LSU this season also has a terrible schedule and just won't be in contention in the SEC West, even though they finished third in the West last season. What about the Texas A&M Aggies? Well, this is a team that has a lot more going for it in terms of maybe making a push for the third or second spot in the SEC West. The reason why, though, I don't necessarily think that they will is, well, some of the similar reasons as to what you have in LSU. Right now, there's not clarity on the quarterbacking position. The benefit they have, though, is that they happen to have good quarterbacks on the roster who've seen a lot of playing time and even split time as starters last season. They don't know exactly who it is that they're going to, go with right now on the year as far as the quarterback goes. And they also are lacking a lot of the offensive weapons that they've had in the past. They don't have Christian Kirk, who was one of the most dynamic players in college football the past few seasons. They don't necessarily have anyone, as far as running backs go, to really run things there. And they kind of seem to be, questionable on defense as well. Not to mention the fact that this is their first season under new head coach Jimbo Fisher, so there will be a bit of a learning curve, you would think, coming from a very spread offense-oriented Kevin Sumlin team and going to a more pro-style Jimbo Fisher type of scheme. So A&M probably has a little, too many question marks going into this season where you would think that they would push for maybe second or third place right now. However, they could. They do have talent there, more than the other teams that are in the West right now. More than LSU, Ole Miss, or Arkansas. They've got more talent. They've got more potential. But it doesn't look like it's shaping up to be a year where maybe they can capitalize on that, especially considering that the two teams that we're discussing right now, Auburn and Mississippi State, return a huge amount of what led to their success last season. The Ole Miss Rebels are still missing a lot on defense to complement a high-powered offensive attack. And Arkansas is just kind of in rough shape after finishing 1-7 last season and, of course, bringing in a new head coach. So this will be probably a wash year for the Arkansas Razorbacks, which leaves us then just kind of de facto with, maybe three teams that you could see making a push for that second spot behind Alabama, and Texas A&M is probably not stable enough this season to realistically make that push. That's why it seems like Auburn and Mississippi State are the two teams to get the most discussion surrounding this area this year. So which one comes out on top? That's kind of the big question here. And if you listen to our full preview on where we think that the SEC West and SEC East will shape up, you can hear that we have some differing opinions on this matter. I, in particular, look at these two teams, and I've researched them quite a bit leading into the season. There were two teams I was assigned to do previews for, so I got a really close look at it. And the thing that stood out considerably to me is that they are incredibly similar teams. They are essentially the same team with just minor differences leading up to it. So let's get into the positional breakdown, go position group by position group, and kind of evaluate what we're working with here. And let's start with the quarterback position. Auburn and Mississippi State return the most experienced or most veteran or most talented, I don't know what you want to say it, quarterbacks in the conference this year. A lot of the headlines concerning the quarterback position are, of course, circling around Alabama quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, who came in the last bit of the national championship game and led the Crimson Tide to the title. It's hard to really necessarily say that he comes in as like the best quarterback in the conference because he's still fairly unproven. But behind him, you pretty much have three people in particular that stand out in the quarterback position, especially based off of experience. That's Drew Lock of Missouri, and then right behind him, probably, Jared Stidham and Nick Fitzgerald, the Auburn and Mississippi State quarterbacks. So right then and there, you see a lot of similarities between Auburn and Mississippi State in that they return veteran leaders at the quarterback position. Where the differences come in here is that those two guys play very different styles. Stidham, of course, is a little bit more of a classic pro-style quarterback. Nick Fitzgerald, much more of a running quarterback. What's interesting there, then, is that Fitzgerald happens to also be significantly larger than Jared Stidham. Stidham's listed at about 6'3", a good quarterback height, especially for a pocket quarterback, but only about 215 pounds or so. Fitzgerald, on the other hand, is about 6'5", 230 pounds. Fitzgerald came out of high school having run a wing T type of triple option offense, and so no one really saw him pass the ball very much. And he's developed into a respectable passer, of course, the past few seasons, throwing for around 2,000-ish yards on the season. His sophomore year, first year as a starter, he threw for about 2,400 yards, and then last season had almost 1,800 yards before being injured in the regular season finale against Ole Miss and missing essentially in two entire games, the Ole Miss game and the bowl game against Louisville. So decent passing numbers. He, of course, has always struggled with his passing percentage, and Stidham, of course, excels with his arm much more so than Fitzgerald does. On the flip side of that, Fitzgerald, what can you say about him? He's rushed for pretty much 1,000 yards in each of the past 2 seasons, 1,375 his sophomore year, 984 his junior year. So he's got the ability to make a lot of plays with his feet, which sets him, apart from what Stidham does. Stidham, on the other hand, of course, comes in as Auburn's starter last season after having been at Baylor in 2015, essentially taking time off, comes in and then throws for over 3,000 yards with 66.5% completion percentage, 18 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Very, very talented passer right there. Don't expect him to ever run the ball. He clocked in 153 rushing yards last season, but that's off of 103 rushing attempts, which means he averaged just about 1.5 yards whenever he was asked to actually carry the football. So if you were to compare directly these two players here, it'd be really hard to actually say that one of them has the leg up on the other one because they excel in different areas. The fact of the matter is, they're very productive quarterbacks in their own rights, so this position is kind of a wash. The other offensive positions is where you kind of see some differentiation, and we're going to jump to the offensive line now. Right here, Auburn is replacing 4 starters on the offensive line, while on the other hand, Mississippi State is returning 4 starters on an offensive line. So right then and there, you have to kind of give the edge to Mississippi State based solely on the fact that we know exactly what we're going to get there. They lost an all-SEC caliber offensive lineman, and they're the best individual talent on the offensive line by a long shot. But they still return 4 starters, whereas Auburn is missing some. Now, granted, it could happen that the offensive linemen come in and instantly excel, but right now it seems like Mississippi State has the edge right here in terms of experience. And not only that, but qualified, talented experience, because this was a line that did not let Nick Fitzgerald get sacked often. Back behind the line and next to the quarterbacks are, of course, the running backs. And this is another area where Mississippi State returns a lot more productivity than Auburn does. Now, Auburn does have up-and-coming star, and number 1 running back in Cam Martin this year, but they're having to replace 2 very talented running backs in Kerryon Johnson and Cameron Petway. And I think I just realized that all of Auburn's running backs from last season who saw playing time, their names started with K's. Kerryon, Cameron, and then Cam Martin. That's really incredible. How did they pull that off? But they lose Kerryon Johnson, who was just an absolute stud of a running back, and Cam Petway, who left early after a less productive injury-ridden junior season. But these were 2 players that in particular also did a lot of work against Mississippi State when the 2 teams met last season over in Jordan-Hare Stadium, and I refuse to pronounce it the way Auburn people do. As a sophomore last year, Cam Martin did rush 74 times for 453 yards, a lot of that action being in games in which he was asked to come in and replace the 2 stars. So it stands to reason that there is obviously a lot of talent there, but you wonder what he'll actually be able to do when he's, consistently the guy against tougher opponents. Whereas on the flip side of that, Mississippi State does return their entire rushing attack from last year. Running back Aries Williams, who clocked in 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns last season. Nick Fitzgerald, the quarterback, of course, who rushed for almost 1,000 yards and 14 touchdowns. And then rising sophomore Kylan Hill, who rushed for almost 400 yards as a true freshman and really looks the part in terms of being just a very solid all-around running back. He also just kind of happens to fit Joe Moorhead's scheme a little bit more. Moorhead, as an offensive coordinator, really, really loved getting the ball to his running backs in space and letting them catch the ball a whole lot more often. And that really seems to kind of set the stage for Kylan Hill to excel in this type of offense. But regardless of what actually happens here, you've literally got, everyone coming back from the Mississippi State rushing productivity perspective. In fact, you even have a chance here for someone like Keith Mixon, who Mississippi State under Dan Mullen used as kind of a slot wide receiver a lot, to see a lot more action from a rushing perspective, because Keith Mixon actually came to college as more of a scat back running back and not a true wide receiver. So depending on how Moorhead decides how to use his rushing attack, he comes back with everyone from last season. Aries Williams, Kylan Hill, Nick Gibson, Dontavian Lee, Keith Mixon, just to name a few. There's a lot of returning here. So you want to kind of tip the scales a little bit more towards Mississippi State in this area as well. They have a returning rushing quarterback, a returning offensive line, and a returning entire running back crew. And this is one of the reasons why people think Joe Moorhead might have inherited the best possible, team of any first-year head coaches, or any new head coaches, rather, this season, is that he basically returns everyone of note on offense. When you get into the wide receiving group is where you see a big discrepancy because, well, simply put, Mississippi State didn't get a whole lot of production out of their wide receivers. Their leading guy in yardage last year was the Right Reverend Jesse Jackson with 276 receiving yards. Keith Mixon had 275 behind him. Keep in mind, that's a guy who is not a true wide receiver, but really was kind of an all-around receiving running back they just put into the slot. And then the third place guy was tight end Jordan Thomas, a massive 6'6" target with 263 yards. Behind him, Dedrick Thomas, another one of those short, shifty kind of slot receiver types. But you notice a trend here. There's not a whole lot of yardage production. And Auburn, on the other hand here, returns basically everyone that they had from last season as far as wide receivers and general receivers go. Not only that, they also had some more productive players. In particular, you have Ryan Davis, who had 800 receiving yards. Someone like Darius Slayton with 600 behind him. Obviously, a much more pass-oriented offense than Mississippi State, but just a really, really good offense in general. I mean, Auburn did so much well. They had a pocket passing quarterback who could deliver the ball to a pretty solid wide receiving group. One wide receiver in particular, Ryan Davis, received significantly more receptions than any of the others. Darius Slayton had 29, and he was second on the team. Ryan Davis had 84. So obviously, there was a favorite target there. But whenever the passing game maybe wasn't working as well, Auburn had really, really good running backs they could rely on to kind of make up for that, and the vice versa is also true. The vice versa? I don't think that's how you say that, but if the running game wasn't quite going, well, they had Stidham, and they had great wide receivers. This year, you kind of think that Auburn's offense is going to be predicated a lot more on Stidham and those wide receivers than the rushing game, especially considering there is offensive line questions, and there's kind of not as much depth maybe from the running back spot. Either way, both of these teams are returning a lot of weapons and are very good offenses. So it's kind of hard to really say that either of them stand out as maybe being the favorites on offense. The quarterbacks are a wash. The offensive line is tilted a little bit more towards Mississippi State. The running backs and general, rushing playmakers, including Nick Fitzgerald, tilted much more so in favor of Mississippi State. But then the passing attack is tilted much more so in favor of Auburn. So it's hard to really say if either of them stand out more than the other. If we switch to the defensive side of things, this is where the two teams' similarities really stand out, in that you're talking about two of the best front sevens in the SEC. Now, both teams have just incredible defensive lines. Auburn's in particular is expected to have multiple NFL draftees in it, but Mississippi State's does as well. They return the SEC leader in sacks in Montez Sweat. They return one of the top defensive tackles, interior linemen in the country, in Jeffrey Simmons. So these two teams are about as close to a wash as you can get on the defensive line. I mean, if you look at a lot of publications that are previewing the conference, they're going to say that when you break down the positional, comparisons, then, I mean, Auburn, Alabama, Mississippi State kind of are the, top 3 defensive line units in the conference. It's when you get into the linebacking core that things kind of change here. Auburn gets a lot more credit as far as their linebackers go because, for good reason. They return a lot more standout talent right there. You can't really overlook the Mississippi State linebacking core, though, and that's because they return a significant amount of experience there as well. They lose a few guys like J.T. Gray, Desmond Harris, but they return a lot of other players who saw significant playing time at the linebacker position, including Leo Lewis, Errol Thompson, Jerry Green, and then a standout freshman linebacker, Willie Gay. So there's a lot of returning productivity from the linebacking core, and there's a good amount of depth in Mississippi State, and that they probably have a solid rotation of 4 to 5 different linebackers that could see significant playing time and are all, pretty equal as far as skill set goes. But Auburn just carries a little bit more weight in this group, and that's why the linebacking core is going to be, we're going to favor Auburn in this one for sure. If we shift to the secondary, though, then it's a little bit of a different story. Mississippi State didn't cover big plays in the secondary very well last season. And a theory that I have about this is because the offense was not built to, do big plays. The offense was built to be centered around a rushing attack of Nick Fitzgerald and Aries Williams. That's why you saw so many passes being sent to giant tight ends. I mean, they had a handful of 6'5", 6'6" tight ends that were used in the passing game a lot because it was a lot more of a possession game than it was a big play type of game. And if you got an offense that just is not producing big plays, then your defense is not really necessarily going to be suited to, watch out for the big play. Along with that, let's not forget that defensive coordinator Todd Grantham really, really enjoys blitzing in just about every play. So it often left the secondary out there to kind of fend for themselves. Mississippi State is going to change their defensive scheme this season, and they also return more productivity, especially in the safety department, than Auburn does. In particular, the 2 team leaders on Mississippi State in terms of solo tackles are 2 safeties, Jonathan Abram and Mark McLaurin, who both come back. Behind that, you have Jamal Peters, who played safety for a few seasons before shifting back to cornerback and was kind of a shutdown corner, and a rising young corner who really excelled in the bowl game against Louisville, Cameron Dantzler. So Mississippi State's secondary might actually be maybe the best unheralded secondary in the SEC. And I specifically say unheralded because, no one really seems to know any of these players, but they're basically all returning, and they're going to be in a defensive scheme that will not leave them out on their own nearly as much as they did last season. Auburn, on the other hand, is a team that, has a lot of talent in the DBs, but that's their weakest point on defense. And this is where the scale maybe goes a little bit back towards Mississippi State, in that this Mississippi State secondary doesn't really have the question marks about it. They know who's returning. They know who they can rely on. The main question with the Mississippi State secondary is whether or not they are built to cut down on the big plays, kind of redeem themselves in that this season, because that was the killer last year. All you have to do is look back at the Egg Bowl against Ole Miss to really see where this discrepancy in big play handling stands out. Mississippi State just had no answers for the Ole Miss passing attack. Granted, not very many people do with that wide receiver core, and when Jordan Ta'amu really, felt comfortable and got, the feel for being the guy at quarterback. But that game in particular stands out as a game that the secondary was not prepared for big plays whatsoever, and the rest of the defense just could not do enough to help them out. On the flip side of that, if you look at the bowl game against Louisville, you see a defense that was not operating at the same level, and so you saw a defense that frustrated star quarterback Lamar Jackson on more than one occasion. Cameron Dantzler is one of those players that really stands out as having a phenomenal game when he was asked to actually play against the wide receivers and not to necessarily be covering, a giant zone because there were so many blitzes going on. And so I think that when you look at something like that, the Mississippi State actually has the edge here in the secondary. But again, you're talking about a defensive line that's pretty much a wash, linebackers that go towards one school, and then a secondary that goes back towards the other school. Gosh, these two teams are essentially the same with just minor differences in how they execute things. So how in the world do you actually predict one of them to do better than the other? I mean, if they're almost identical, what is different? And there's two things that fade into this, and that's experience and schedule. Let's look back to the 2017 season when Mississippi State traveled to the Plains and played against Auburn. Auburn at this point in time was really hitting their groove, and Mississippi State, had done well, but then had the misfortune of having to go to the two teams that will then play in the SEC championship game at the end of the season. So Auburn handled business, winning 49-10. These were the first two tests for a Mississippi State team that had started off against Charleston Southern, then a 57-21 victory against Louisiana Tech, then a comfortable 37-7 win over LSU. Then you get blown out by both Georgia and Auburn on the road before, redeeming yourself against Brigham Young, having wins against Kentucky, handling business out on the road against Texas A&M, which I think is a significant game, and eventually ending on a good note, kind of coming all together as a team and rallying behind the interim coach, Greg Knox, and beating Louisville at the end of the season after losses to Alabama and Ole Miss and a win against Arkansas and UMass. So if you look at that, I think that LSU game is really what's telling, because the victory over LSU actually sparked quite a bit of a turnaround for the Bayou Bengals, and they ended the season on a stronger note than they did start the year. Yes, there was the loss to Troy that happened in there, but they did significantly better in the conference after losing to Mississippi State. And as the season went on, Mississippi State also became a little bit more of a comfortable team. So it's hard to look at something that happens in September, such as the loss to Auburn and the loss to Georgia, in comparison to what seemed to be a completely different team at the end of the year. So this 49-10 victory in Jordan-Hare Stadium in Auburn last year, it's hard to really gauge what the impact on that could possibly be for this season. Because this season, there's a lot more expected out of both of these teams, so the expectation is that it's going to be a little bit tighter of a game. Not to mention the fact that Mississippi State kind of ended the season on a higher note than Auburn did, Auburn losing both the SEC championship game and their bowl matchup against the national champions, Central Florida. But that being said, Auburn did handle business against Mississippi State last season, so the edge, coming into this year, it goes in Auburn's favor. But then we look at the schedule for this year, and it is tilted pretty heavily in favor of the Mississippi State Bulldogs. And this is the reason why I think, and I predicted, if you listen to our final episode of the SEC preview series we've been doing, this is why I think that Mississippi State could, and I predicted them to go ahead and finish in that second spot, because their schedule is a little bit more favorable than Auburn's is. Let's look at the Bulldogs. They open up play non-conference against Stephen F. Austin. They then go in what will be probably a nasty away game, Kansas State in Manhattan, Kansas. And this is a matchup that I would not be surprised to see Mississippi State lose. They get to kind of tune things up a little bit again in a matchup against Louisiana, which I can't get over the fact that they're just like the Louisiana Raging Cajuns and not Louisiana Lafayette anymore. But anyway, the Louisiana Raging Cajuns. They travel to Kentucky, which is always just a nasty road trip to have to go on. Then they get Florida and Auburn at home. They travel to LSU, which you never know what will happen there, but then they get Texas A&M at home. After that's Louisiana Tech, traveling to Alabama, which will most likely be a loss, Arkansas at home, and then you never know what will happen in Oxford in the Egg Bowl. But Auburn, on the flip side of that, has a nastier away game slate, in particular in the conference, because they have to play their toughest conference opponents on the road. They open up against Washington and whatever that is, and then they get Alabama State. But then when conference play starts, they have LSU at home, which is nice because LSU is going to be a bit of a mess of a team this season, and Auburn gets to open up conference play at home. They get Arkansas at home. They have Southern Miss in between there, but then they have to travel to Starkville. Then they get Tennessee at home, but then they have to travel to Oxford. And if, as I mentioned before, the Auburn secondary is the weak point on their defense, and Ole Miss has a great offensive line, a good quarterback, and a great wide receiver core, then Ole Miss might have the ability to take down the Auburn Tigers, just based off of how those matchups go. They also get Texas A&M at home. Auburn does, that is. But then Auburn has to go to Georgia and has to go to Alabama to end the conference slate. They only have 4 away games. They only have 4 conference away games, but they happen to be the biggest conference opponents they have. The team that won the SEC last season, the team that will likely win the SEC West this season, the team that matches up against them on an offense to defense standpoint, maybe the closest out of anyone in Ole Miss, and then the team that a lot of people think will be their biggest challenge to finish second in the West, Mississippi State. So if we look just at that, it really seems like Mississippi State gets the edge on the Auburn Tigers for taking that number 2 spot in the SEC West. And that's why I make my prediction there. But obviously, as we've talked about in this podcast episode, gosh, it could go either way. It honestly could go either way. These are 2 teams that are essentially the same. It's not surprising. I mean, honestly, look at the history of the programs just in terms of, well, how the schools were founded and what they were based on, and well, agriculture, land-grant universities, who often get looked down upon by their in-state rivals as being, the redneck school, the cow college. This storyline just kind of makes sense for Mississippi State and Auburn to be almost the same team leading into this season. So if you're almost the same team, the intangibles are going to be what really defines how your season will go. How do you handle your road games? Mississippi State, I could see, winning their away conference games against Kentucky and LSU. Probably not Alabama, and could very well give up against Ole Miss, depending on how the 2 schools are at that point in time. But Auburn, on the flip side, I can honestly see them losing all 4 of those away games to Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Alabama. And if that's kind of the defining factor, then it tilts back towards Mississippi State. But finally, the thing that I think will really play into this is that, and I mentioned this before, and I mentioned this when our little subject, or in our little preview when I interviewed my friend Chad Gibbs. Anytime Auburn has a good year, they follow it up with an 8-5 season. Last time they had a great year and went to a BCS championship game, they followed it up by going 4-4 in the conference, which included a loss at Mississippi State. So unless Auburn can figure out how to keep the ball going, how to keep the momentum their way this year, because they do return a huge amount, then it stands to reason that they might fall victim to the same trend that has happened under Gus Malzahn. And that right there is why I'm given the slight edge to take the second spot in the SEC West, the Mississippi State Bulldogs. But as stated, it could really go either way. Who's your pick to finish behind Alabama in the West this season? Or do you think that one of these teams could actually take the number 1 spot from the Tide? Surprise everyone. Let us know. Also, let me know if you think that, for example, Texas A&M ends up, sneaking into that maybe one of these spots and displacing Mississippi State or Auburn, who I think will finish 2 and 3 in the conference, or in the SEC West in particular. Tweet at us, let us know at ROTC Sports on Twitter. Comment on our post on our website, rotc.podbean.com, and make sure that you are sharing subscribing, telling all your friends to tune in to Running Out the Clock, because next week begins our actual SEC season episodes. Can't wait to be there. Thank you for listening. I'm your friend, Joseph Craven, and I'll see you next time on Running Out the Clock.